Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we bring to life the hidden and powerful stories of America's past. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss these timeless stories. Now, let us step back into history. Asterisk, the colonies that would one day become the United States were not simply lines on a map, nor just farms, towns, and trading ports built in the wilderness. They were human battlegrounds where faith, fear, survival, and ambition collided every single day. What is often left out of the polished history books are the stories of ordinary men and women whose names were forgotten, yet whose struggles carved out the foundation of America. This story begins not with powdered wigs and speeches, but with mud-stained shoes, hunger, whispers of rebellion, and the silent courage of people who lived on the edge of the unknown. The year was 1676. Virginia was young barely, 70 years since Jamestown had been carved out of the swamp. It was a place of hardship and plenty, of loyalty and betrayal. The tobacco fields stretched across the tidewater, owned by wealthy planters who ruled over the land like lords. But beyond those fields, where the forest grew thick and the rivers twisted through the wilderness, there lived the forgotten, indentured servants, poor farmers, and restless frontiersmen. They carried scars on their backs and a fire in their hearts. They had crossed the ocean to find a better life, but instead found chains made of debt, laws written for the rich, and a constant threat of attack from the native tribes who were being pushed from their ancestral lands. Among these restless people was a young servant named Thomas Ridley. He had sailed from Bristol with nothing but a tattered satchel and a letter from his mother, who had begged him to send word back when he found freedom in the New World. But freedom was not what Thomas found. His master, a planter with vast lands, treated him as little more than a beast of burden. For 7 long years he bent his back in the hot Virginia sun, cutting tobacco, hauling barrels, and building fences. His hands were blistered and raw, his spirit bruised. Yet, like so many others, he held on to the hope that once his indenture was done, he would be free. But freedom in colonial Virginia was a promise often broken. When indentured servants finished their contracts, they were supposed to receive freedom dues, a small piece of land, some tools, and a few coins to start a new life. But the great planters, who sat in the House of Burgesses, tightened their fists around the land and gave little or nothing. The freedmen, hungry and angry, drifted into the frontier, where they found only more danger. Thomas soon learned that he was not alone in his bitterness. In taverns and around fire pits, whispers spread among the poor. They spoke of the corruption of Governor William Barclay, who ruled Virginia with iron and velvet, protecting the wealthy while ignoring the cries of the common people. They spoke of taxes that bled them dry, of favoritism that lifted the elite, and of the governor's refusal to defend the frontier families from raids. And so, the ground trembled with the first signs of rebellion. One man stepped forward to lead them, Nathaniel Bacon, a tall, fiery young planter who was both cousin to the governor's wife and hated by the governor himself. Bacon was not a poor man, but he carried the anger of the poor. He saw the injustice, and perhaps more dangerously, he saw an opportunity. When the governor refused to authorize attacks against the native tribes who had raided frontier homes, Bacon took matters into his own hands. He rallied the desperate servants, freedmen, and farmers. They came with muskets on their shoulders, their clothes torn and patched, their faces set with grim determination. Thomas Ridley was among them. For the first time in his life, he felt like his voice mattered. He felt like his struggle was not his alone, but part of something greater. When Bacon raised his hand and swore, they would fight not just for defense, but for justice, Thomas shouted until his throat burned. He was ready to burn down the old order and carve out a new one. The rebellion swept through Virginia like wildfire. Bacon's men marched on Jamestown itself, muskets loaded, hearts pounding. The governor fled. The rebels torched the capital, and the sky filled with smoke that carried the smell of defiance. For a moment, the forgotten men and women of Virginia felt like the future was theirs. They tasted freedom not in promises, but in the flames of revolution. But freedom is a fragile thing. Disease struck Bacon's camp, cutting down men who had survived the battlefield. Nathaniel Bacon himself fell ill and died, his body wasted and weak. Without their leader, the rebellion crumbled. The governor returned with loyalist troops, and the punishment was merciless. Rebels were hanged, their bodies swaying in the wind as warnings. Lands were seized, debts were enforced, and the iron grip of the planters grew even tighter. Thomas Ridley watched his friends executed. He felt the chains of despair close once more around his neck. Yet something inside him had changed. He had seen, if only for a moment, that the powerful could be challenged. He had seen ordinary men rise up and demand to be heard. And though the rebellion had failed, the fire it sparked would not die. The hidden story of Bacon's rebellion is not just the tale of one man who defied the governor, but of the countless nameless laborers who risked everything for dignity. It revealed a truth that would echo across the colonies. The divide between rich and poor was as dangerous as any enemy beyond the frontier. It showed that beneath the polished image of colonial life, of grand houses, fine clothes, and bustling ports, there was anger, hunger, and the will to resist. And yet, as Thomas Ridley and others struggled, another storm was brewing. Because the planters, frightened by the unity of black and white servants in rebellion, began to look for a new way to divide the lower classes. From this fear grew something dark, something that would haunt America for centuries: the codified system of racial slavery. The story of colonial America is not only about liberty, it is also about how power sought to control, to divide, and to silence those who dared to demand more. As the ashes of Jamestown cooled, new laws were written, new chains forged, and a new America slowly began to take shape. The flames of Jamestown had burned out, but the fear they left behind smoldered in the hearts of the ruling elite. Governor Barclay and his circle of planters knew the truth. Bacon's rebellion had revealed a dangerous unity. White servants and black laborers had stood shoulder to shoulder, muskets in hand, fighting for the same cause. That unity terrified those in power more than the rebellion itself. Because if the poor, no matter their color, could rise together, then the entire order of Virginia might one day collapse. The wealthy planters decided that such unity must never happen again. They knew that land, money, and titles could keep them apart from the poor whites. But what about the black men and women, both enslaved and free, who had marched alongside servants like Thomas Ridley? If they could be separated, if their lives could be marked as permanently different, then rebellion could be weakened. Out of this fear, the laws began to change. By the end of the 17th century, Virginia passed codes that darkened the future of thousands. Children born to enslaved, women would themselves be slaves, no matter the father's status. Servants, once temporary, became chained for life if they were black. Whippings, branding, and mutilation became punishments written into law. And most damning of all, a new idea began to harden, that race itself defined a person's worth. Thomas Ridley, who had once fought side by side with African laborers, saw the change with his own eyes. The taverns where poor whites and blacks had once spoken freely now grew tense with suspicion. Planters whispered poison into the ears of white servants, telling them they were better than the black men and women beside them. It was a cruel trick, and it worked. Divided, the lower classes grew weaker, easier to control. But hidden in this grim chapter of colonial history are stories rarely told, stories of those who resisted, who risked their lives to keep bonds of friendship alive despite the new barriers. Such story comes from the tidewater marshes of Virginia. There, in a half-hidden cabin built from logs and reeds, lived a woman named Mary Willoughby. She was the daughter of a poor English farmer, indentured at 16, freed by 22. She had nothing but a small plot of marshy land and a spirit that refused to bend. Her closest friend was an African woman named Amma, who had been stolen from her homeland years before. Amma had been forced into labor on a nearby plantation, but often slipped away at night to Mary's cabin, where the two women whispered their dreams by the fire. Mary knew she risked punishment for harboring a runaway, but she did not care. She had seen enough of the planter's cruelty, enough of the lash and the chains. Amma, in turn, taught Mary things no Englishwoman could have known: how to read the stars, how to brew medicines from wild plants, how to weave baskets strong enough to hold stones. Between them grew a sisterhood that defied the new laws. It is said that during one harsh winter, when food was scarce and the planters hoarded supplies, Mary and Amma built a network of hidden caches in the woods, where stolen corn and smoked meat were left for other runaways to find. No record in the governor's office tells this tale, but fragments survive in letters, whispers, and the memories passed down in families. The story of Mary and Amma reminds us that while the powerful wrote laws to divide, ordinary women and men quietly defied them. The deeper truth of colonial America is that it was never as simple as masters and servants, or black and white. It was a land of shifting loyalties, hidden alliances, and secret acts of courage that history books too often erased. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the colonies grew more complex. Towns like Williamsburg and Philadelphia bustled with trade. Ships from England arrived with barrels of goods, cloth, iron tools, salt, and rum, while ships leaving the harbors carried tobacco, timber, rice, and indigo. Beneath this prosperity, however, the shadows lengthened. For every wealthy merchant or planter, there were hundreds who lived in poverty, scraping survival from rocky soil, working endlessly for others, or suffering under the weight of chains. Struggle was not only for survival, but for dignity, for identity, for the simple right to be seen as human. We find one of the most haunting hidden stories in South Carolina, where the rice plantations spread like green carpets across the tidal rivers. The work was brutal. Men and women waded into flooded fields under the punishing sun, their bodies half submerged, hands tearing at mud thick with leeches and snakes. Death by fever was common. Yet the planters cared little, for rice brought wealth beyond measure. But within those flooded fields, something remarkable happened. The enslaved Africans brought with them knowledge of rice cultivation that the planters themselves did not possess. They built intricate irrigation systems, carved canals, and devised methods to manage the tides. It was their skill, not the planters, that made Carolina rice famous across the Atlantic. And with that knowledge came another hidden act of defiance, the preservation of culture. Even under the lash, even in the swampy rice fields, African men and women passed down songs, stories, and traditions. They created a new identity, the Gala people, who blended African languages, rhythms, and beliefs into something lasting and powerful. The planters thought they owned the bodies of the enslaved. What they never truly owned was their spirit. Meanwhile, far to the north, the Puritans of Massachusetts wrestled with different struggles. They had crossed the ocean, seeking religious freedom, but built societies that demanded strict conformity. In towns like Salem, whispers of witchcraft would one day consume the people, leading to one of the darkest and most infamous chapters of colonial America. But even in New England, where sermons thundered from pulpits and laws were carved from the Bible, there were hidden stories, women who resisted rigid roles, men who questioned authority, children who dreamed of lives beyond the rigid fences of their villages. Their stories, like those of Thomas Ridley, Mary Willoughby, and Alma, were threads woven into the larger fabric of America. Colonial America was not a land of simple beginnings, but of endless contradictions. Freedom and slavery lived side by side. Faith and fear shared the same pews. Wealth glittered in the hands of a few, while hunger gnawed at the bellies of the many. And beneath it all, ordinary people carried secrets of rebellion, of friendship, of survival that shaped the soul of a nation long before independence was ever declared. The story does not end with division. For even as laws sought to separate, hearts and hands found ways to come together in defiance. That hidden truth, buried under centuries of polished history, is what makes the colonial era not just a tale of governors and kings, but of men and women whose courage still whispers through time. The dawn of the 18th century painted the colonies with both promise and peril. From the stony fields of New England to the swampy coasts of the Carolinas, life had become more settled, yet no less dangerous. The small wooden villages of the 17th century had grown into bustling towns with markets, taverns, and churches. Ships crowded the harbors of Boston, New York, and Charleston, carrying goods that tied the colonies ever tighter to the Atlantic world. But beneath the surface of this growing wealth lay hidden tensions that pulsed like an unseen current. The divisions between rich and poor, free and enslaved, believer and skeptic, were sharper than ever. And in these divisions lived the untold stories of ordinary men and women whose names rarely appeared in records, yet whose choices shaped the future of America. One of the most haunting hidden tales of this period unfolded in South Carolina in 1739. The rice plantations had grown vast, their profits fattening the pockets of planters who lived in fine houses and dressed in imported silks. But the enslaved men and women who worked those plantations carried something far more dangerous than rice baskets or hoes. They carried memory and a hunger for freedom. On a September morning, the air thick with humidity, a group of enslaved men gathered near the Stono River. They were led by an Angolan man known as Jemmy. Tall, strong, and sharp-minded, Jemmy had seen enough of whips and chains. He knew that life under the planter's lash was not life at all. With him were 20 others armed with stolen muskets and machetes. They had made a choice that few dared to make. They would rise. The Stono Rebellion began with fire and fury. The rebels marched from plantation to plantation, shouting for freedom, burning houses, and striking down overseers. They moved with a desperate hope, believing they could reach Spanish Florida, where freedom was promised to any enslaved African who could escape the English colonies. For a brief, shining moment, their voices rose above centuries of silence. They were not property, not shadows in the rice fields, but men fighting for their own destiny. But the planters, terrified of this uprising, gathered militias and struck back with brutal force. By the time the smoke cleared, dozens of rebels lay dead, their bodies displayed as warnings. Jemmy's dream of freedom was crushed in blood, yet the memory of the rebellion lingered like a wound in the hearts of both enslaved and free. The Stono Rebellion, often overlooked in polished history. Books revealed a truth that the powerful feared, that even in chains, the human spirit longed for liberty. It showed that beneath the wealth of the colonies was a foundation built on resistance as much as on labor. But rebellion was not the only hidden story of the early 1700s. Far to the north, in the rocky soil of Massachusetts, another storm was brewing, not of muskets and fire, but of fear and accusation. The year was 1692, in the village of Salem. It was a place where faith ruled every corner of life. The Puritans who had settled New England had crossed the ocean to escape persecution. Yet in their new world, they demanded strict obedience. Children were expected to remain silent, women to remain modest, men to obey the ministers. But beneath the stern faces and scripture-filled sermons, there was unease. Crops had failed, sickness had spread, and the wilderness around them seemed filled with unseen threats. Fear crept into the minds of the villagers, and from that fear grew suspicion. It began with whispers about strange fits among young girls, who claimed to see visions and feel invisible pinches. Ministers declared it the work of witches. Accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by old grudges, jealousies, and the heavy weight of superstition. Neighbors turned against neighbors, friends against friends. Men and women who had lived quiet, faithful lives were suddenly dragged into court, accused of serving the devil. One of those accused was Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother. Known for her kindness, she had raised children, tended fields, and lived a life of faith. But when her name was called out in the meeting house, her fate was sealed. Despite her protests of innocence, despite the pleas of her family, she was found guilty. In July of 1692, Rebecca Nurse was hanged, her frail body swaying on the gallows. Her story, like those of others executed in Salem, reminds us of the hidden cost of fear. While history often reduces the witch trials to a cautionary tale of superstition, the deeper truth is that ordinary people, neighbors, mothers, daughters were destroyed by the need of the powerful to control. It was not just hysteria. It was the dark side of a society that demanded silence and punished those who stood apart. Yet even in Salem, resistance flickered. Some villagers, horrified by the trials, spoke out against them at great risk. Families who lost loved ones kept their memories alive, passing down stories of injustice that refused to be buried. In that refusal lies another hidden strength of colonial America: the unwillingness of some to let truth be silenced, even when it cost them dearly. While Salem wrestled with fear and the Carolinas with rebellion, the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, were places of mixing, where Dutch, English, German, Quaker, and others lived side by side. But harmony was not always easy. In 1712, in the heart of New York City, another hidden story of resistance burst into the open. There, enslaved men and women, pushed past endurance by harsh treatment, gathered in the dark of night. Armed with hatchets, swords, and a few stolen guns, they set fire to a building and struck at their oppressors. Like the rebels of Stono, their fight was desperate, fueled by the dream of freedom. The uprising was quickly crushed, and the punishment was savage rebels burned alive, their ashes scattered. Yet the uprising revealed that even in the busy streets of New York, far from the rice swamps of Carolina, the hunger for liberty burned just as fiercely. These hidden uprisings, whether in the rice fields, the cobblestone streets, or the small New England villages, remind us that colonial America was not a quiet march toward independence, but a land of constant struggle. Every act of rebellion, every whispered defiance, every unjust trial chipped away at the surface of control and exposed the truth that beneath the authority of governors, ministers, and planters, ordinary people lived with unbreakable courage. 18th century was still young, but already the colonies were filled with echoes of rebellion, fear, and hope. And these echoes would only grow louder, shaping the generations to come. By the middle of the 18th century, the colonies stretched far beyond what the first settlers could have imagined. From New Hampshire to Georgia, towns were bustling, roads were carved deeper into the wilderness, and ports roared with trade. The sound of hammers building ships in Boston mingled with the calls of traders selling sugar in Charleston. Farmers in Pennsylvania loaded wagons with wheat, while merchants in New York filled warehouses with goods from across the Atlantic to the outside world. The colonies looked like a success story. But beneath this appearance of prosperity lived 1,000 hidden tensions. For while the planters and merchants grew rich, the gap between rich and poor deepened. While sermons thundered from pulpits about loyalty to God and King, whispers in taverns questioned both. And while governors paraded in fine coats, the people in the fields, workshops, and taverns carried the heavy weight of taxes, debts, and wars that were not of their choosing. One of the great shadows of this period was the war that stretched across continents, the conflict known in Europe as the War of Austrian Succession, and in the colonies as King George's War. It was a struggle fought between empires, but its cost fell on ordinary colonists. Men were drafted into militias, leaving farms and families behind. Taxes rose to pay for fortifications. The sound of cannon fire echoed along the coast, and villages feared raids from French ships or their native allies in Massachusetts. One hidden story tells of a woman named Abigail Proctor. Her husband was taken into the militia to fight in the campaign against the French at Louisbourg. For months she managed the farm alone, struggling to keep the fields alive while raising 3 small children. The war was distant, fought on cold northern shores, but its shadow lay heavy on her home. When her husband finally returned, his body was weak from fever, and his spirit broken by the sights he had seen: men frozen in trenches, comrades buried in shallow graves, the endless march of suffering that ordinary soldiers carried for the sake of empire. Abigail's story, like that of many colonial women, was never written in official reports, but it was as real as any battle. It was in the silent endurance of women like her that families and entire colonies survived. The mid-1700s were also years of powerful spiritual awakenings that shook the colonies in unexpected ways. Ministers like Jonathan Edwards in New England and George Whitefield, who traveled from colony to colony, brought thunderous sermons that set hearts ablaze. People gathered in fields and meeting houses, weeping, shouting, and trembling as they listened to fiery words about sin, grace, and redemption. This great awakening was not just about religion. It was about ordinary people demanding a voice. Before, churches had often been controlled by wealthy families, with pews bought and influence wielded by the elite. But the revival preachers spoke directly to the common man, the servant, the woman, the enslaved. They told them that salvation was for everyone, not just for those with land or title. This terrified some ministers and governors who saw their control slipping away. But for countless colonists, the revivals planted a dangerous idea: that authority could be challenged, that each soul had worth, that each voice mattered. Hidden in the revival meetings were stories rarely told, like that of an enslaved man in New Jersey known as Samuel. Born in bondage, he found himself drawn to the traveling preachers. One night, in a crowded barn lit by flickering candles, Samuel rose to his feet and began to pray aloud. His words shook the crowd. For a moment, the chains of law and race dissolved, and the people listened to him not as property, but as a brother in faith. His master, furious, tried to silence him, but the memory of Samuel's prayer spread among the enslaved and free alike. It was one of many moments in which faith gave birth to courage, courage that would echo when the time for liberty finally came. The mid-1700s also brought waves of new immigrants who reshaped the colonies. In Pennsylvania, Germans came in large numbers, tilling the soil and building tight-knit communities. In the backcountry of Virginia and the Carolinas, Scots-Irish settlers carved cabins into the wilderness, fiercely independent and quick to anger at any hint of authority. These newcomers added richness to colonial life, but also tension. The coastal elites looked down on the rough farmers of the backcountry, while the settlers resented the taxes and neglect from faraway governors. Out of this divide would grow conflicts that revealed the deep fractures in colonial society. One such conflict came in North Carolina during the 1760s, known as the Regulator Movement. Poor farmers in the backcountry, weary of corrupt sheriffs and crushing taxes, rose in protest. They demanded fairness, an end to the extortions of officials who lined their own pockets. Armed with muskets, they clashed with colonial militias. Though the movement was eventually crushed, its spirit lived on. The regulators showed that ordinary farmers, with little more than courage and muskets, could defy corrupt power. It was a lesson the colonies would soon remember on a much larger stage. Meanwhile, in the bustling port of Boston, hidden tensions were brewing of a different kind. British officials demanded more control over trade, enforcing taxes and restrictions. That angered merchants and sailors. Smuggling became a way of life, as colonists quietly defied the crown. Among them were men like young John Hancock, who built his fortune partly on goods slipped past customs. But beyond the wealthy merchants were the dockworkers and sailors hard, men who lived by their fists and wits. They felt the weight of taxes most heavily, for every coin mattered in their daily survival. In taverns along Boston's waterfront, they grumbled about Britain's heavy hand, their words growing bolder with each pint of rum. One hidden story from Boston tells of a sailor known only as Black Jack, a free man of African descent. Tall and broad-shouldered, he worked the docks, hauling cargo and sailing ships. He was known for his booming laugh and his fearless temper. When British customs men harassed local sailors, Black Jack was often at the center of the fights that broke out. Though his name rarely appears in official records, his presence in the taverns and wharves of Boston shows how freedom's earliest cries were not spoken only by gentlemen in wigs, but shouted by rough men whose lives were spent in the salt and sweat of the harbor. The mid-1700s were years of building pressure, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Wars drained the colonies of men and money. Revivals stirred the hearts of the common people. Immigrants brought new strength and new anger. Farmers rose against corrupt sheriffs. Sailors fought against unfair taxes. And everywhere, the hidden. Stories of women, servants, enslaved men and women, and common laborers revealed a simple truth. The colonies were not quiet subjects of an empire, but restless people whose courage and suffering were shaping a nation not yet born. By the 1760s, the colonies had changed. What had once been fragile settlements carved into wilderness were now thriving towns, proud farms, and busy ports. The people no longer saw themselves as mere dependents of England. They had built lives in a land that felt more their own with each passing year. Yet with that growth came conflict. For the British Crown, the colonies were not a land of dreams. They were a source of wealth, meant to be taxed and controlled. When Britain tried to tighten its grip, the first sparks of rebellion were struck. But those sparks did not come only from famous men in fine coats. They came from taverns filled with smoke, from women gathered around spinning wheels, from sailors with salt still in their hair, from enslaved men whispering of freedom. The hidden stories of this era remind us that independence was not born in a single speech or document, but in countless quiet acts of defiance that built into a roar. It began with taxes. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, all demanded money from colonists who already scraped to survive. For a Boston merchant, these taxes were a blow to profits. For a farmer in Virginia, they were an added weight on already crushing debts. For a dock worker, they meant higher prices on the rum and bread that fed his family. And so anger simmered in every corner of colonial life. One story often overlooked is that of the women who rose to defy these taxes in their own way. When British goods were boycotted, women became the heart of resistance. They spun their own cloth, brewed their own teas, and swore not to buy the luxuries shipped from England. In New England, they gathered in groups known as the Daughters of Liberty, working their spinning wheels late into the night. Their calloused fingers turned wool into thread, their quiet determination feeding a movement. To the world, it seemed small, but to the colonists, It was powerful proof that resistance lived in every home. In Rhode Island, a widow named Sarah Osborne took the boycott to heart. She had lost her husband at sea and struggled to raise her children. Yet when neighbors spoke of giving up the boycott for the sake of convenience, Sarah refused. "Better to drink water than British tea," she said, her voice firm as iron. Her defiance, though never written in official histories, was a part of the tide that carried America toward independence. Meanwhile, in the streets of Boston, resistance took on a rougher face. Sailors, apprentices, and dock workers, the men known as the mob, were the muscle behind protests. When customs officers seized smuggled goods, or when soldiers strutted through the streets, it was these men who shouted, cheered, and sometimes fought. Their anger boiled over in March of 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5. The Boston Massacre became a symbol, but the names of the dead Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick Patrick Carr were not just symbols. They were fathers, sons, laborers, and sailors, men whose blood stained the cobblestones. Crispus Attucks, in particular, carried a story too often hidden. He was of African and native descent, a man who had escaped slavery and found work as a sailor. For years he had hauled cargo, braved storms, and fought for wages in a world that saw him as less than equal. On that March night, he stood at the front of the crowd, shouting for liberty. When the soldiers fired, he was the first to fall. His body, lying lifeless on King Street, told a truth the colonies could not ignore: the first to die for American liberty was a man who had been denied it his whole life. The anger spread beyond Boston. In Virginia, fiery speeches from men like Patrick Henry echoed in the halls of the House of Burgesses. But just as powerful were the whispers of resistance among farmers, tradesmen, and enslaved men who longed to see the chains of empire broken. 1. Hidden story tells of a young blacksmith named Isaac in Williamsburg. He was no statesman, no soldier, but when news of the Stamp Act spread, Isaac refused to shoe the horses of the local tax collector. "Let him walk as we do under his burden," he said, hammering steel with sparks flying. Small acts of defiance like his rarely made the pages of history, but they carried weight. For every Isaac who stood firm, the British grip weakened as the 1770s moved forward. The tide of resistance grew bolder. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 was more than a protest against taxes. It was a declaration that colonists would no longer bow their heads. Yet even here, the hidden stories shine. Among the men who boarded the ships and dumped chests of tea into the harbor were apprentices, laborers, and sailors whose names were lost. They disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, not to mock, but to send a message that America was becoming something new, something not British. In the cold salt water that night, liberty tasted sharp and sweet, but the road to independence was not only paved with unity. It was also marked by division, suspicion, and sacrifice. For every colonist who cheered rebellion, there were others who remained loyal to the crown. Families were split, friendships shattered. A father might side with Britain while his son marched with the rebels. A brother might raise his musket against his own kin. The revolution, when it came, would be a war not only against an empire, but within homes themselves. In the quiet fields of Pennsylvania, a German farmer named Heinrich wrestled with this choice. His neighbors spoke of liberty, yet his heart feared the chaos of war. He had crossed the ocean to escape bloodshed, not to invite it to his doorstep. Still, when British soldiers marched through his county, seizing food and trampling crops, Heinrich made his decision. He joined the local militia, shouldering an old musket with trembling hands. His story, one of thousands, shows how revolution was not only the work of great leaders, but of ordinary farmers pushed to act when the weight of empire grew too heavy. and what of the enslaved? For them, the revolution was both a hope and a heartbreak. British officers offered freedom to any enslaved man who fled his rebel master and joined the king's side. Thousands took the chance, running under cover of night, leaving behind families, and all they had ever known for the faint promise of liberty. Some found it. Many did not. In Virginia, a man named Titus, later known as Colonel Ty, escaped his master and joined the British. Fierce and fearless, he led raids against rebel farms, striking terror into those who had once held the whip. To his former masters, he was a traitor, but to the enslaved, he was a hero. His story, rarely told in American classrooms, is a reminder that the fight for liberty wore many faces, and not all of them aligned neatly with the rebellion. By 1775, the storm could no longer be held back. At Lexington and Concord, muskets cracked in the April dawn, and the revolution began. Yet even here, hidden stories cry out. Farmers dropped their plows, apprentices threw down their tools, and women melted their pewter plates into bullets. Ordinary people, nameless to history, poured their courage into the first shots of war. The revolution, as it rose, was not only the story of Jefferson's pen or Washington's command. It was the story of sailors like Crispus Attucks, widows like Sarah Osborne, blacksmiths like Isaac, farmers like Heinrich, and runaways like Colonel Ty. It was the story of countless ordinary souls whose struggles and sacrifices gave life to liberty. And as the drums of war echoed through the colonies, the hidden stories of colonial America entered their most powerful chapter, the birth of a nation carried on the backs of those history too often forgets. The revolution had begun, but it was no smooth march toward victory. For 8 long years, the land bled, and the people carried burdens heavier than history often remembers. In the great telling, we hear of Washington, of Jefferson, of Franklin, but beneath their names lay the sweat, hunger, and sacrifice of thousands whose stories were never written down. Their struggles are the hidden heartbeat of America's birth. Winter came early to Valley Forge. In 1777, snow lay thick on the ground, and the men of Washington's army had little to shield them. Some marched barefoot, leaving bloody prints in the snow. They had no proper coats, no meat for their bellies, no medicine for their fevers. Men died not from bullets, but from hunger and cold. Yet through that frozen misery, they endured. They endured because their dream of liberty was worth more than warmth, worth more than comfort, even worth more than life itself. Among them was a young soldier named Josiah from New Hampshire. He had left his farm in his mother's care to march with the army. At Valley Forge, his hands were cracked and bleeding, his body so weak he could barely stand guard. Yet when asked why he stayed, Josiah answered simply, "Because freedom does not come cheap." His name never reached the history books, but his sacrifice was no less than that of any general. Beside the soldiers stood women who carried a different kind of bravery. Some, like Martha Washington, brought supplies and comfort to camp. Others went further still. At Monmouth in 1778, when her husband collapsed in the heat, a woman named Mary Ludwig Hayes picked up his cannon ramrod and took his place. Under the name Molly Pitcher, she loaded and fired through the smoke. Her hands blistered, her dress singed with powder. She fought not for glory, but because the line could not falter. She fought because America's freedom was every person's burden. Many women carried their resistance in quieter ways, spying, carrying messages, hiding fugitives in their homes. Anna Strong of Long Island hung laundry on a line in secret codes to guide spies. A black woman named Phyllis, enslaved in Philadelphia, risked everything to pass along scraps of overheard British plans to rebel leaders. Their courage was not seen on battlefields, but it was carved into the very survival of the cause. And yet, freedom was not equal. For the enslaved, the revolution was a wound as much as a hope. Both sides offered promises, and both sides broke them. Thousands of enslaved men fought for the British, lured by the offer of liberty. Others fought for the Patriots, believing the ideals of freedom might one day be extended to them. One such man was Peter Salem, born into bondage in Massachusetts. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, Peter fired the shot that killed a British officer, leading the charge. The moment was hailed as a turning point in that battle, yet his name was nearly forgotten. He fought bravely through the war, yet when peace came, the land of liberty still denied him his own. His story, like so many others, whispers of promises half-kept and dreams deferred. The war also tore through native lands with merciless force. Tribes were divided, some siding with the British, others with the Americans, many hoping only to preserve what little remained of their world. For them, the revolution was not a fight for liberty, but a battle for survival. In the Ohio Valley, the Shawnee saw their villages burned, their people scattered. In upstate New York, the Iroquois Confederacy, once strong and united, was torn apart, brother against brother, tribe against tribe. The hidden story of America's founding includes this tragic truth, that while one people won freedom, another saw theirs stripped away forever. Even loyalists, those who clung to Britain, paid dearly. Entire families were driven from there. Homes, their lands seized, their names cursed. In New York, a widow named Margaret Hutchinson, loyal to the crown, was dragged from her farm by rebel neighbors. Her house was burned, her sons forced into exile in Canada. History calls them traitors, but in truth, they too believed they were standing for honor, for order, for the life they knew. Their suffering, though rarely spoken of, is a part of the revolution's shadow. And then there were the final battles, the grinding years when hope flickered and nearly died. The soldiers who stayed with Washington at Yorktown in 1781 were not polished or glorious. They were farmers, cobblers, fishermen, men who had left everything behind. When the cannons thundered and the smoke choked the air, they stood shoulder to shoulder, hearts pounding not with thoughts of fame, but of home, of freedom, of peace. One soldier wrote in a letter that as the British drums signaled surrender, we wept not for victory, but for the end of suffering. Those tears carried the weight of every grave dug, every family left behind, every hidden sacrifice that carved the path to liberty. When the war ended, America was born, but not in perfection. Freedom was still flawed, justice incomplete. Women, who spun and fought, were told to return to silence. Enslaved men who bled for liberty were chained again. Native tribes were pushed further into the shadows. The revolution, in truth, was both a triumph and a tragedy. But its hidden stories reveal something deeper, that liberty is not a gift handed down by great men, but a struggle lived, suffered, and carried by countless ordinary souls. The dream they planted was larger than their lives. They may not have seen its full flowering, but they set its roots deep in American soil. And so, when we remember the Revolution, we must remember Josiah in the snow, Mary at the cannon, Peter with his musket, Anna with her coated laundry, Titus leading his raids, Margaret losing her farm, and the nameless thousands whose lives gave. Shaped to a nation, America's story is not only written in the halls of Congress or the marble of monuments. It is written in the sweat of farmers, the courage of widows, the blood of sailors, the tears of mothers, the footsteps of those who walked barefoot through snow for the hope of something greater. The hidden stories of Colonial America are not just echoes of the past. They are reminders that liberty has always been bought with sacrifice, that freedom has always demanded courage, that the America we know was built not only by leaders, but by ordinary men and women whose voices still whisper if we dare to listen. And so, as we close this journey through hidden history, Let us carry their memory forward, not as forgotten names, but as the true foundation of a nation that was born not once, but again and again in the hearts of its people.